Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Gideon Rose, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and formerly editor of Foreign Affairs, joins us from Berlin. Gideon, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel. Thank you so much for taking time to speak to us. Now, I wanted to start by asking you, I recently read your article in Foreign Affairs titled "Ending War is Hard to Do." And I wanted to ask you, to what extent do geopolitical realities change with elections, and will U.S. national interests remain the same despite a change in the White House?
So this is a great question because the objective realities of power and national interests don't change, obviously, just because somebody has an election, but the perceptions of them can, depending on the people involved and the administrations involved. And what you have right now in the US is a very strange situation because my country, frankly, is going through a bit of a nervous breakdown, and nobody is exactly sure what's going to happen next. And so you have a mixture or a conjunction between a situation that remains relatively constant from December to January to February, and yet a radical change in one of the major players, the United States, and how it sees the world. And we don't even know, it's not as if there was just a radical change from one thing to another. The new thing, the Trump administration, is itself not just a work in progress, but a bit of a random number generator, as we've seen this past week. And so everybody is sort of watching this as much as they are sort of analyzing it, because nobody knows what's going to happen next.
Now, you say that the United States has three major interests in the European struggle. One is to save Ukraine, then to protect Europe, and to check Russia. Can a plausible settlement be achieved in all three areas?
So I think that if you had a relatively sane, relatively normal administration in Washington, this might well be the time that you could start to think about ending the war with some kind of settlement. I personally would like to continue to support Ukraine until Russia is, if not defeated, then at least on its back feet. But there's a significant degree of dissatisfaction with the war in Europe and the United States, a lack of desire to keep paying. And it's very difficult to see how you're going to push Russia significantly further back. So one could imagine a situation, even let's say in a future Biden administration or a Harris administration, had there been one, in which there would be a desire to end the war. And you could imagine, even with this team in the Trump administration, relatively normal members of the people of the administration, someone like a Marco Rubio, for example, could be advocating ending the war with something of a territorial compromise that splits the difference. Fundamentally, this war is about control of Ukraine. Will Russia be able to reabsorb Ukraine, either directly back into Russian territory or with some kind of puppet government in Kiev that fundamentally is a vassal of Moscow and follows its interests? So that's what the war is about. It's not about the threat to Russia from NATO expansion. It's about Russia's desire to reestablish control over Ukraine because it was drifting west. That's why it started in 2014, right. And it's what's going. So you could imagine splitting that difference with a settlement that allows Russia to keep the territory it has conquered and the rest of Ukraine to go off and live its own life connected to the West, etc. But that would require significant security guarantees and aid to post-war Ukraine. And it's not clear either whether the Trump administration is eager to do that, but particularly whether Putin would even want that. In other words, if Putin really wants to resubjugate Ukraine, he might want to keep fighting until he gets not just a ceasefire in place, but some fundamental settlement that allows him to conquer or control post-war Ukraine. And I think that's where the rubber will meet the road as we go forward, because the Trump administration will try to negotiate some kind of deal, but Putin will decide in the end what sort of deal he is willing to accept. And that may not be what even the Trump people are willing to stomach.
Right. But do you think that the United States and the European Union fundamentally underestimated the willingness of Vladimir Putin to use large numbers of his own young men as cannon fodder in this relentless fight against Ukraine?
So yes, I think that so it's an interesting question because what Russia has chosen to do, first, Putin miscalculated because he thought he would be able to take Ukraine quickly and easily.
Exactly.
That the West wouldn't object to this, wouldn't get in the way, and that the Ukrainians wouldn't really fight. He believed his own propaganda, sort of like the Bush administration in Iraq. He thought it would be a quick, easy, simple war that he would be welcomed as a liberator with flowers and so forth, and it'll be all over quickly. That was a deep miscalculation. The Ukrainians fought back. The Europeans and the Americans ultimately supplied them with some materiel and weapons and aid that enabled them to fight back, and the war has turned into a horrible, dragging stalemate. And at that point, it became a question of who had the will to last longer. The Ukrainians, along with their European and American backers, kind of bet that if Russia was faced with a stalemate, it would ultimately back down. And instead, Putin has doubled down. And so he's now betting that he could outlast the West because they will get tired of supporting Ukraine before he gets tired of trying to take it. And that's where we are now. And unfortunately, his bet is looking better. And so the West underestimated how devoted he was, being willing to mortgage his entire country's future, turn Russia into a garrison state, turn Russia into a client of China, simply in order to take Ukraine back. But that's where we are, and that's the choice he's made. And the interesting question now is, given that that's the choice Russia is making and Putin is making, what will Europe and the United States and Ukraine do in response to that?
Right. But do America's European allies understand that if Ukraine does agree to a peace deal, which involves territorial concessions to Russia, this kind of a settlement would ultimately leave Europe facing a militarized aggressor with a track record of rather successful conquests?
So I think that Europe is somewhat in denial. There was a lot of rhetoric and a lot of talk when the war started about how horrible this was. German Prime Minister Olaf Scholz talked about the Zeitenwende, a complete turning point in views. There was a sense that the desire to trust Russia or work with Russia was recognized in retrospect as a mistake. And there was a desire to support Ukraine, resist this, and help fight off the Russian attack. But 3 years on, that will is declining, and there isn't much popular support. Even though there is some elite rhetoric towards supporting the Ukrainian war effort, there isn't much support for raising defense expenditures significantly, for sending more aid and money. And so right now there's a giant gap between the rhetoric that the European countries and the United States, frankly, have been using with regard to the war and the actions that they are prepared to use to back up that rhetoric.
Right. Can I be very blunt here? Can Ukraine defend itself without American aid, solely relying on its European allies? No.
And so I think that the Europeans need to step up dramatically. And if the Trump administration fundamentally is prepared to cut off Ukraine entirely and abandon it, the Europeans might try to scramble to fill the gap. But at least at this point, that's going to be very, very hard for them to do. But we'll just have to see what happens.
Right. Now, what about American interests in the Middle East? I mean, if you could single out America's top 3 interests in the Middle East, what would they be?
So there are a lot of interests in the Middle East, but in regard to the Gaza conflict in particular and what's happening there are, I think, 3 chief ones, which is there was a desire to protect Israel, a desire to check Iran and its influence, and also secondarily, although it's not really seen as such, a desire to preserve the possibility of Palestine. This last is the most complicated one because not everybody in America agrees with it, but everybody in the region agrees with it, because if there is going to be lasting peace in the Middle East, not just a temporary truce, then the fundamental aspect of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict needs to be addressed. And that has to be through some form of two-state solution, because Israel's not going anywhere. The Palestinians are not going anywhere. And what was in some respects so tragic right now is you could imagine a situation going forward in which there could be actually a U.S.-Israeli-Saudi coalition that could actually not just check Iran, but bring some significant stability to the region, following up the Abraham Accords, normalizing Israel in the region. But to do that, the Netanyahu government or any Israeli government would have to agree to return to something resembling the traditional Middle East peace process, in which there's a hope that the occupied territories could someday become something that was Palestinian rather than just a colony of Israel.
Right,
and
but in light of all this,
now there isn't that immediate possibility. So we'll just have to see what happens.
Right, but do you think the United States should recalibrate or at least reconsider its relationship with Israel to balance its strategic interests, its democratic values, and its pursuit of, as you said, a two-state solution? Is there any appetite for this at all in the U.S.?
I don't think there's any appetite in the U.S. for rebalancing its fundamental commitment to Israeli security and its fundamental alliance with Israel. There are so many ties, everything from strategic to intelligence to economic to ideological to demographic, that I don't think that alliance is going anywhere. The question becomes, however, whether the United States will use some of its leverage to pressure Israel to do some things that everybody knows, except many Israelis, is in Israel's long-term interest, but that the Israelis are too outraged and furious to accept, which is restart some sort of fundamental move towards shedding responsibility for the occupied territories and turning them over to some sort of Arab Palestinian control. And the question would be, how do you get that process moving? The recent ceasefire could be a step in that direction if it were followed up, as the Biden administration was trying to negotiate, with a deal that would stabilize post-war Gaza with the help of some regional forces, and then ultimately pave the way for a U.S.-Saudi reconciliation. But I don't think the Trump administration is particularly eager for that. So unfortunately, I'm more pessimistic, even more pessimistic about the Middle East than I am about Ukraine.
Now, let's very briefly zoom out of this entire Middle Eastern situation. How would you define the core principles of a sustainable grand strategy for the United States in the 21st century?
So we had a good one. We just have sort of lost our way, which is clearly in the international system, power is crucial, and power has to be maintained by a balance of forces in which the forces that want stability and freedom and economic openness are sufficient to deter and, if necessary, defeat the forces that are opposed to that. And right now you have countries from Russia to China, to Iran, to North Korea, that are trying to overturn the liberal order that has essentially put in place peace and security ever gradually and ever more so for the last 80 years globally. And the great tragedy of the Trump administration is that Trump himself doesn't seem to believe in this order that the United States has created. The transatlantic alliance, which is at the core of that, NATO, is something that Trump sees as a burden. His moves to threaten allies such as Denmark or Canada or Mexico are all geared towards unwinding the alliance system that should be the pride and joy of American foreign policy. So the challenge is how to reconstitute the emotion and the passion and the desire to move the liberal international order, a zone of peace and security, forward rather than have it further evaporate. But what's going to happen next, nobody knows.
Right. Now, you touched upon China. So as China continues to expand its global influence, what should the U.S. do to balance competition with cooperation, particularly in areas such as trade, technology and military presence in the Indo-Pacific?
So this is a great question. And, you know, during the Cold War, which ended successfully and peacefully, George Kennan developed this concept of containment, which was essentially hold off military threats while allowing the systems to compete and let the better system win. And in the end of the day, the open system in the West, the capitalist system in the West, managed to outwit, outplay, and outlast, like in survivor terms, the closed systems of the East. That could replicate itself with China now, although it's a more complicated situation because China has become partly capitalist and is growing rapidly. But the basic notion of keeping a military check on Chinese ambitions while allowing the peaceful evolution and competition of both sides to go forward is a good one, I think. And so my strategy towards China would be to essentially continue to protect Taiwan, continue to support American alliances in East Asia and in the region more generally. We've been doing that with things like AUKUS, the alliance between Australia and the United States and the UK, move something good with India, some kind of partnership there. All that could be done in place while continuing not to provoke a crisis, but to develop our economy to grow and become sort of our best selves, which in the long run, unless you believe that China has a better system, which I don't think it does, the challenge here is, like in the Cold War, how to outlast an aggressor or a rival who is threatening but is fundamentally not offering a better system. And that requires confidence in one's own system and calm steadiness rather than recklessness, rather than aggression, rather than craziness, which unfortunately is what we're getting now.
Right, but are there dangers associated with pursuing a transactional foreign policy that is not guided by values?
Absolutely. There are lots of dangers. And the chief danger is that the United States has led a liberal order in the post-war era that has gotten past, or seemed to have gotten past, much of the fundamental problems of previous world history, which were powers competing for each other, jockeying for advantage, and ultimately ending in war. And then lather, rinse, repeat, the same cycle repeating itself. After World War II, we and others realized that cycle can't continue. There are nuclear weapons now. It was devastating to everybody before. It'll be even more devastating. So let's operate as a team of countries devoted to peace and growth and security and mutual development. And that has provided a large degree of order and stability for much of the world over 80 years. And why the Trump administration thinks this is something to be abandoned and to return to a pre-international order mode of simple country using force against other country and beggar thy neighbor policies economically, it's madness and insanity. And all one can do is hope that it passes briefly and that we get back to some kind of more cooperative foreign policy that is firm against enemies, but is open and welcoming towards friends.
Do you see parallels between President Donald Trump's policies and historical isolationist movements? And what lessons can we learn from past periods of U.S. isolationism, and how can they inform us on the future of American foreign policy?
It's a great question. We thought we had learned these lessons in the past. Unfortunately, we need to relearn them again. And the lesson is, any country, if it plays just for itself, even if it's a great power, ultimately is not going to be able to assure its security and its prosperity and its long-term development if it doesn't join with other like-minded countries in some kind of partnership and teamwork. That was the lesson of the 1930s. That was the lesson of all history before that. And what happened after 1945 was that the United States under Roosevelt and Truman chose to use its temporary moment of power not to oppress others, not to dominate others, not to create a new empire and grab territory, but to create something resembling a partnership of equals. It created the UN. It created NATO. It gave money with the Marshall Plan to help Europe get back on its feet. It ultimately didn't abandon or conquer Japan and Germany, but rebuilt them as allies. And those policies have led to an ever-expanding zone of peace and security in the world, which, however frayed around the edges, ultimately has worked better than any system known to man previously. And so the lesson of the past is don't retreat to isolation. Don't retreat to autarky. Don't pick fights with your neighbors unnecessarily. And the only question is how long it's going to take this administration to relearn those lessons, because it doesn't end well any other way.
Right, but we've seen a lot of polarization among the American population. It's impacting domestic politics, of course. But can the country pursue a more coherent and effective and bipartisan foreign policy?
Well, that's a great hope, and not right now. But maybe after some mistakes. You know, in the first week, we saw this time around, just like in the last administration of the Trump administration, sort of slipshod measures and radical attempts at change, which were so poorly thought out and so poorly executed that they simply had to be rescinded. And it's obviously too much to hope that sort of this will just be a bad dream that we'll live through and everything will go back to normal. But if the returns on Trump, the policies that Trump has laid out and that he tries to put into place, if the returns on them are negative, and obviously negative, then there may well be pushback and reaction, and there'll be midterm elections in 2 years, another presidential election in 4 years. And the challenge is to see how much, whether the damage of the current new policies can be contained, and whether after those policies fail, there can be some attempt to return to more constructive global leadership, which right now nobody seems willing or able to provide, which is a very sad thing for us, for you, and for the world at large.
Right. Gideon Rose, it was such a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
My pleasure.
Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?